Hello, I'm John Brink and we are podcasting from the capital of Northern BC, Prince George. Beautiful day in Prince George, beautiful summer day. Finally we have some rain, highly overdue. And today is a very important podcast and a very interesting one. It is in the series of BC forest industry and transition. And my guests are very exciting guests actually from Sweden. And it is a friend, Jan Hedberg, that has been a friend for many, many years, 13 years at least, and who is with a bus load of people, about 40, usually forest-related individuals, taking a tour through this part of Canada, and visited us today, and obviously is here as a guest. And is John Hedberg is a forester, and he is also the CEO or the owner of Scots. How do you call that?
Skogsresor.
Yeah.
Skogsresor. Forest tours or forest travels.
Yeah, and then the organization that you are with is called?
I'm a member of Forest Owner Association with the name Mellanskog, Middle Forest.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that has lots of members, right?
About 28,000 members.
How many?
28,000.
28,000 members.
Yes.
Wow. And then obviously the other guest is Richard Lehmann. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Richard is a guest with Jan Hedberg on the tour. Was at our operation yesterday, had dinner with them last night. It was very, very pleasurable and very interesting. Obviously, we talked about forest industry all over the world, and obviously that's what we're going to talk about today. And both Jan and Richard are foresters and have a history in the forest industry. We'll talk about that a little bit. And with Richard, he is a forester and has a Masters of Science in Forestry.
Yes.
And I believe he has a company that is involved in sourcing fiber. Maybe tell us a little bit about what you have.
Yes, I was regional manager for Stora Enso, a big Swedish-Finnish forest company, and they had two big paper mills in the south of Sweden. One doing newsprint, one doing normal white copy paper.
Okay.
And we bought cutting rights from private forest owners. They were also members of a organization.
Right.
Yeah. So I had 50 wood buyers that went all out negotiating with private forest owners, buying cutting rights. Yeah, average 1,000 cubic meters. Clear cuts and thinnings.
Okay.
And then we had 50 harvesting groups logging all this bought stumpage, and then we sorted out on every cutting site different saw logs to different customers. All the spruce pulpwood went to one mill, all the other pulpwood from birch or beech and pine went to the other paper mill. So we cut about 3 million cubic meters in my organization.
Okay, so that's a lot of volume.
Yeah.
So you go right from sourcing it, dealing with the owners of the forest, either that are private or government or other organizations. Maybe talk about that a little bit. Is that the forest in British Columbia, 95% of it is forest that belongs to the province of BC and the people, and then very little private, and mainly on the coast. And then, the lumber companies are in different groupings. They have tenure or renewable forest licenses. And then we have the annual allowable cut in the province that will be calculated on a sustainable yield. And so the tenure companies don't own the timber and do not have an area, but rather volume-based tenures. And so that's kind of how it works here. And then, very difficult to start a new company because all the timber virtually is committed here.
Yeah.
Now, if I look at Sweden, that I believe 50% of the timber in Sweden is private, and then 25% is
about bigger companies, and then 1/4 we used to say is more public, state, communities,
Church.
municipals.
Yeah. And then here, obviously we have all kinds of challenges in BC right now, is that we have had a period early 2000 of pine beetle pandemic that probably affected 1 billion cubic meters of timber that had to be harvested, and was harvested over 15 years, about that 15, 16, 17 years, to get it out, to make sure that it didn't deteriorate to where there was no more economic value in it. So during that period, the annual allowable cut in BC used to be around 60 million cubic meters approximately, but was uplifted to as high as 80, 85 million cubic meters just to deal with the pine beetle. Then further, in addition to all of that, we had a case of spruce beetle affected us mainly here in the northeast side of east of Prince George and east of Mackenzie, just somewhat north.
Yeah.
So all of that and some of the other things that have happened has reduced the AAC in the province from the norm of 60 to something more closer to around 40 million cubic meters annually. The result of it has been that we have too much manufacturing and not enough fiber. Too much capacity, not enough fiber. And subsequently, throughout the province, close to 40 to 45 sawmills have closed. And then here, a lot of times, the ratio I usually use between, for every pulp mill, if you have 5 sawmills, would supply a pulp mill. So about 7 or 8 pulp mills also were closed. In addition to that, as you already know, we have had a lot of fires, more so than we have ever had before in history, which will also affect the annual allowable cut even further. And the pressure that we have had now, that we believe, I believe at least, that we will see another 5 or 6 sawmills close down and probably another couple of 2, 3 other pulp mills.
Yeah. And we have been out in the forest today taking part of some of this also in the field. So it's very interesting for us to come and to have
so
this.
You were in, just for our people that are watching, you came just today. You arrived in Calgary?
Yes, we flew into Calgary.
And then from there you want?
1 day out on the prairie to get that kind of ecosystem before we went up in the Rockies, Banff, Jasper, and then we had the way over here with a couple of stops on the way. So we visited the ancient forest.
And then you were in Jasper.
Yep.
Stayed there for a night.
Yep.
And then you came to Prince George.
Yes.
Spent the evening and the later afternoon with
you,
with me and my company.
Yes.
And then stayed here overnight again.
Yep.
Yep.
And then you want to Vanderhoof.
Yes, tomorrow.
And to L&M. That's where you want today, right?
No.
Oh, where did you go today?
Today we went out to see a logging operation.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, about 2 hours north of here.
Okay.
And we saw when they cut down contorta pine that was affected by the mountain pine beetle 15 years ago.
Yeah.
So it was 70% dead trees
Yeah.
and 30% trees that were alive.
Yeah.
And it was very small dimension. I think the forest was like 80 years old,
Right.
but it had grown up after a forest fire 80
Right.
years ago.
Right.
So it was very dense stand, very many trees per
Yeah.
hectare.
Yeah.
And the loggers did a really good job. They even picked up dead trees that had been lying down for 5-10 years
Yeah.
and made saw logs out of that. Very impressive.
Yeah. So the fellow that you were visiting his company, and we have done a podcast with him, was
Yes.
Liam, right?
Liam Parfit
Yeah.
and Freya Logging.
Yeah. And that was in north of Prince George, right?
Yeah.
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 And Sinclair Group was a company that are hosting us today. So we are very thankful for this opportunity to come out in the forest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was very interesting to see this, and especially what he was doing is a bit unique in the industry and shows what you further can do. A lot of times we are not doing as much as we can, right?
Yeah.
I kind of believe, that I came to Prince George 60 years ago, in 1965, nearly 60 years ago. And I then was in the forest industry, in particular in this region. It was a boom town because there was lots of fiber, lots of timber, and there had been lots of sawmills here in the region. As I explained yesterday to the tour, is that in the 50s we had as many as 600 sawmills around Prince George. Most of them were in the forest. So they would have a single sawmill in the forest that cut down the trees and then put it into boards, 2x4, 2x6, 2x8, 2x10, whatever, and rough on strips, and then they sold it to the planer mills. And the planer mills were on the road, on planer road they called it, now called River Road. And there were probably 10 or 12 or 14 different planers that would buy the lumber from the little sawmills. And then, since the government owned the timber, there was change to policy because some major companies had made proposals to build pulp mills. And in fact, that as a result of that, 3 pulp mills were built here in the 60s. The 2 that we saw, Intercontinental, Prince George Pulp, and then Northwood built a pulp mill as well. And the legislation was that if you wanted to cut timber from the people, then you have to have close utilization. You could not just square it up and then waste the wood. You had to have debarkers and chippers to make chips.
Yeah.
And a lot of people could not afford that because it would cost too much, and they start selling out to the larger companies their timber rights.
Yes.
And gradually the industry started consolidating more, with fewer and fewer sawmills around. So when I came in 1965, the pulp mills had just started, and the mills were all consolidating in another area of town and were buying off other sawmills, and the process continued pretty much all along the way. But today, if I look at this region, we have maybe 4 or 5 sawmills. That's about it.
Yeah.
And then in the province, we have the annual allowable cut. We probably have 5 or 6 sawmills that control all of that. And so then after the beetle kill and then the recession, depression between 2006 and 2009 or 10, and I'm sure the same happened in Europe.
Oh yes.
Was a very tough go. More companies consolidated, sold out, or went under. All the names on the buildings started changing, and all of a sudden we had a different industry. And I always thought that the period 2006 to about 2010, I've seen about, in all the years that I had my operation here, 50 years, I'd seen 6 or 7 of the downturns, but never one that went as deep as the one in 2006, 2009. Recession, nearly depression. We survived that, and I thought that's probably the worst one I will see. It was dwarfed again by COVID. But starting with here, to the industry, with the pine beetle pandemic that virtually destroyed or started to affect all the lodgepole pine. It started in a park here, Tweedsmuir Park, just north of Burns Lake, and you've been there before.
We have a meeting with a professor that was at UNBC before, Staffan Lindgren.
Right.
He's going to have a lecture for us when we further up on the tour.
Right.
And he was working, he's an entomologist, and he was helping the forestry here with research during this period. So he has been following the whole time since it started 1996, I think, in that park.
Yeah.
So we will meet him in Vancouver Island, on Vancouver Island.
On this trip or the...
Yeah, on this trip. He will have a lecture when we are coming down.
Oh, I like that.
He moved from Prince George to Nanaimo area.
Okay, so that's where you're going to go before you go back to Calgary and then back to Sweden.
Yeah, we fly home from Vancouver.
Yeah, nice. And so just a little bit of background there for our guests that are watching from around the world is that the policy here that if it is a park and if the den is, like this case, pine beetle pandemic, they cannot go in the park and deal with the start of a pandemic, unfortunately, in my opinion. And that's the second time that something like that happened. Before that, in the early 80s, we had it east of Prince George in the Bowron region. You drove by the Bowron region, just about 50 kilometers east of Prince George, but then further towards the south is the Bowron region. Very beautiful timber there in that area. There was a very large spruce beetle pandemic there as well. And even to the extent that at that point they would say they could see it from the satellites, the big clear cut, because what the government then did and the forest industry, that the pandemic was here, but they then passed legislation to start right here and then move in to where the problem was.
Yeah.
Okay, and we heard about one big clear cut that we talked about today, 180,000 hectares. Could it be that one, or do you know how big it was when the big clear cut was?
For the pine beetle pandemic?
Yes.
It affected the entire beetle population really in the province, in the interior. I don't know exactly what the percentage is, probably at least 30% of the fiber in the province is mainly spruce pine, balsam fir, in this region, and and pretty well most of the pine beetle was destroyed all the way from here, further north, and then all the way virtually up to the Kootenays and the Okanagan.
Yeah.
Very little left of the pine beetle, and the total volume over the period was probably 1 billion cubic meters. So
that's massive.
Yeah,
incredible.
And obviously that would affect the calculation of the annual allowable cut, and at some point it would have to be adjusted, and that's what has happened now. And as a result thereof is that we have too much capacity but not enough fiber.
Yeah.
Which then meant that any incremental fiber, meaning not tenured wood, but other incremental, the bidding for that would go way up in terms of, for the mills it was important to have sufficient fiber to run economically, and they would bid the prices up, and that's still happening today. And I think we talked about that a little bit, is that to deliver even in this region, and everybody's fairly protective of their numbers, but in a lot of cases the cost of delivered fiber per cubic meter to a mill could well be $120 to $150 a cubic meter in this region. And in some cases where it is incremental fiber that is not tenured or that is available in the marketplace, could go as high as $200 a cubic meter. Now, if you then look at the prices today, is somewhere less between $400 to $500 per thousand board feet. I would think in most cases the break-even point probably would be somewhat north of $600. So everybody is somewhat underwater. And so that's kind of where things are right now. We will see more curtailments in my mind, and then it becomes a question of, a lot of the bigger companies, they have decided to invest elsewhere. Canfor, West Fraser, Interfor, Western, and other companies, Tolco, have invested in the U.S. Southeast. Probably up to 20 mills were built there in southern yellow pine, and
also in Sweden.
Pardon me?
Also in Sweden, Canfor have bought sawmills in Sweden.
Yeah,
as well.
And then Vida in Sweden, right?
Yeah.
What is the company name again?
Vida.
Vida. Yeah.
They saw about 2 million cubic meters sawn wood.
Okay.
And they have 10 sawmills in South Sweden.
Yeah. It's a fairly big company, right?
Yes, and very, very impressive company, very productive, very profitable.
Right.
And they have grown on the market in South Sweden, bought up smaller sawmill companies.
Right.
And they have a different philosophy compared to what we see here in Prince George. Instead of having huge, very big sawmills where you have to transport the logs maybe for 4 hours to get them here, they have said better have small sawmills, or small, they are quite big, but scatter them out so you get short transport. Then they have specialized every sawmill to a different market. So, for instance, one sawmill is just making sawn wood for the Netherlands market, and they talk a lot with the customers. How do you want your wood, and so on, and they really interact with their customers.
Yeah.
Then another sawmill could be specialized in doing construction wood to a Japanese house factory. So the Japanese, they are very specific.
Yeah.
They want the wood not 1 millimeter longer than the specification. So
yeah, very particular about quality and
yes.
and finishing, right?
Yeah. So when you get that long time relation with a customer, then the price don't go up and down like it is on the studs in the US market. You had $2,000 per 1,000 what do you call it?
Board feet.
Board feet. and then it goes right down in the cellar, and then it goes up again.
That's pretty much what it is here. It's a roller coaster ride going up and down, and the difference may be. I grew up in Holland and worked in the forest industry there, and in the process visited several times Sweden, Sundsvall, and some of the other big companies that were operating there. As we bought coastal loads of lumber to Holland, then further remanufactured those products into specialties, then what has happened since that time in the 50s and 60s, if I look back, correct me if I'm wrong, is that Sweden went through a difficult period too. 100 years ago, if I look back at the history, and 50 years ago, when there was too much capacity, not enough fiber, and where they then decided that intensive forestry was important because the land base they have, and the interesting part about it, Jan, is that and Richard, is the land base that we have is that if I look at commercial forest, that the land base in Sweden is about between 22 and 23 million hectares. In BC, it's about 22 million, very similar. Total volume logged would be, here in Canada would be, or in BC would be about then, and this is a bit older, about 2009, 2010, but it gives you a general idea, was around 50 million cubic meters annually. Where in Sweden then it was around 65, but since 2010, intensive forestry, thinning and doing all those kind of things, it gradually has climbed to close to 90 or 100 million cubic meters.
Yes, that's correct.
We cut
on the same land base.
Yeah.
And that's the lesson to be learned for BC, right?
Yeah. And the impressive thing is that the growth of the forest has increased since 50 years back, from like 60 million to 120 million. And the cutting from like 45 million to 90 million in 50 years.
Right.
So we're still adding to the forest capital more
forest than you're harvesting.
Yes.
And even going beyond that, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So our forest industry, they know that we can invest and there will be forest to cut in
Correct.
the future. So we have heavy investments in the forest industry since 10 years.
The other interesting part about Sweden is that of the commercial forest, Sweden has about 1%.
Yes.
Of the forest land, yes?
Yeah.
But 5% of the products of the forest industry sold in the world is from Sweden. An amazing record. And again, those show the numbers of, and I believe, and you guys are the experts, but that the timber very similar to BC, what we see in Sweden.
Yes.
And then the qualities are the same. What I found when I came here in 1965 from Holland, and then having been used to mainly lumber from Sweden, because that's mostly what we bought. Then we bought some from Russia, Central Europe, but the best quality timber that we would buy came from Sweden. And then, seeing the quality that we manufactured, all the finished products, maybe moldings, maybe roofing, maybe flooring, or whatever it was, always came from that quality. And it reminded me when I first came in and saw the timber that we had here and the products that we manufactured here, the quality of the wood was extremely similar. The first thing that shocked me when I came here is the amount of fiber that would go up the burner conveyors. Everybody had burners.
Yeah.
Half the tree would go up the burner.
Yeah.
I just couldn't believe it.
No.
Yeah.
And the other part that always stood by me is that my grandfather was a master carpenter. My dad worked in the forest industry. And obviously I started working in the forest industry when I was 14. And I would not dare to step on a piece of lumber. That's kind of the culture that I grew up in. You would respect the lumber. Here, a lot of times it was the land of plenty. And to a certain extent, with all due respect, I love Canada, I love BC, I have a passion for the forest industry, but I think we can do so much better. And that makes me vocal about it and all the other kinds of stuff. I believe that we can do much better with the fiber, and it comes down to, you know, we mainly manufacture here dimension lumber. I call it the 2x4 economy. Yeah. And it mainly is sold into the US market. And then we go, even in the 50s when I grew up and was working in the industry in Holland, and in the 60s until I left in 1965, the Canadians would come down, the manufacturers from this region in particular would come down to us in Holland and try to convince us into, and we love the Canadians because they liberated Holland and everybody loves Canadians, right? Mm-hmm. So, but they would come down and try to sell us 2x4s. But it was kind of a joke for us because we knew that was only a one-time deal, and then when the U.S. market comes back, then you wouldn't see them anymore. And the other part was that they didn't fully understand that the culture of building houses is different in Holland and the rest of Europe and China and other places as well as that it is here. And you know, so, but we kind of staying with the 2x4 culture here in our manufacturing, and I believe that there are so many more opportunities in further manufacturing and value-added manufacturing that we need to go in that direction, even in British Columbia.
Yeah. And do you think these big sawmill companies will change? Try to develop themselves for making more products than 2x4?
The challenge, Richard, is this one. And if we are sitting here, you guys are expert in your field, I'm in this one, and then you know, that has been exposed to Europe and Canada and worked here for 60 years in the industry, is that the challenge that we have here is that, and the challenge the industry has, and I say that respectfully, is that most of the industry, the big players in the big five that control most of the timber in the province of British Columbia, are not investing in British Columbia right now. They are investing mainly in the US Southeast, and they have already built up to 20 sawmills there, and most of the mills there are adding to capacity up to 7 billion board feet annually production, of which up to now there's only about half of that is up. So they will again have the volume dimension lumber manufacturing mainly in the US Southeast that where their attention is now. Here there is a real challenge because they have really not invested in the mills because of that the economic viability is not there. The cost of fiber is too high. And there are a number of reasons for it. Is that the terrain is different here, the politics are different, and then I believe although we are replanting, for every tree that we harvest we are replanting 3, but we can go further in that and do what Sweden did.
Yeah, we used to say the same. We plant 3 trees for every cut trees, And then for us with Swedish eyes to come here and to have this exchange with you and Sinclair and BC Forest Service, and it's so very important because the global situation now with the climate and global change, we need to be more efficient to use all the forest land. And you have so much capacity. You have about 15 times more forest land in Canada than we have in total, if you look for the whole land country.
Correct.
And we have things to learn from you, and I think we have some experience that could be good for you also when we look into pre-commercial thinning, and we had that discussion in forest today also.
With Leanne.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he has been visiting Sweden also. He knows the culture there, and so it's interesting to go and see what happens in other countries. And you have the land. You have a lot of land.
We have it all.
Yeah.
So then I say, I know. What then is the problem? There are a number of problems that make us uniquely different from Sweden, other than we have the same forest land base or more. We have the same species virtually as you have. We can substantially increase the volume per hectare, all of that. So what is then the problem? Well, the problem is a number of things. Is that over the years, at least from my opinion, forest policy in British Columbia, relatively compared to Europe, Sweden also, correct me if I'm wrong, is relatively new. You know, it probably started already in the 40s, 30s, down the coast mainly, not so much in the interior. And then it really started in the interior in the late 40s, 50s, and then gradually grew into these big companies that manufactured cheap timber and started to go into dimension lumber or the 2x4 culture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the other part about it was that it consolidated the control of the timber by fewer and fewer companies. And then the other problem is, at least in my opinion, is that the timber is, I don't say a problem, but a fact that didn't help it necessarily, is controlled by the government. And with all due respect to any government, they're not very efficient and effective in managing volumes of whatever it is, usually, other than that's entrepreneurial stuff, that's what the businesses will do. And then here in British Columbia, we have government in British Columbia that changes every 4 years or so. There's an election. And we have a left-leaning government or a right-leaning government. And so when you have a left-leaning government, then different policies are developed that do not necessarily attract investment. And then we go the other side, and then so policy is not consistent in terms of how do we develop a long-term strategic plan that goes at least forward 60, 80, 100 years in saying this is what we must do. Like, this is the land base that we have, let's make sure we do thinning and taking care of the land base. The companies that have the timber, it's based on volume-based tenures, not area-based tenure. So there's no incentive to invest in the land base. That's one of the issues. The other one is not consistent policy going forward. And then the other issue is, in my opinion, that when I came here in 1965, it was still looked at, the lodgepole pine was looked at as a weed. Nobody wants too small. They were all looking for this big timber. And that was as recently as the 60s and 70s. Now, the company that you will go to tomorrow, L&M, the part of the Sinclair Group, those are companies that started up mainly in that time period, the 70s, 60s, in that area, and were looking mainly at lodgepole pine. Now, a lot of those companies in the smaller sizes, and so that's how they kind of developed. But relatively speaking, that's not all that long ago. That was looked at as a weed. Mm-hmm. And then the other challenge is that value-added manufacturing, which has been the key to what I believe the industry in Sweden, is that when I talk to you about when I was in Holland and we were importing from Sweden, making all these products for our industry, the Swedes took over most of that and developed product manufacturing in Sweden that they could supply directly to our builders. And that was very effective, very well done, and it helped their industry and it helped their resource, and it made the companies in Sweden profitable companies, even in the challenging times that are now behind us. Right here, as an industry, we are really struggling, even now today, in the dimension market, which is way down. Obviously, the other thing, and you said it as well, Jan, is that the forest industry is a global industry now. And that's how we have to learn to look at it, and then look at our forest here, and then we have to redesign the program right from the base up. And it's not reinventing the wheel. Sweden went through all of this. They were there 100 years ago, and then 50 years ago they decided to change direction and strategy, and likely even now, when we were talking just today, is there are still people that believe that the forest strategy is not the right one, but that is normal for all the things.
It always changed over the years, but we had the first Forestry Act we had 1903, so we have a long history, and we have had forestry for 150 years, and we have time to make this very efficient, and we have a small piece of land compared with you, so we have been very efficient on this land. Yeah. The total export value is more than 20 billion Canadian dollar today.
Wow.
So it's maybe 22 billion Canadian dollar today.
But I think it starts with the ownership. I think that's the big difference between Sweden and Canada. That in Sweden, BC, the forest in Sweden is owned, 50% is owned by 340,000 forest owners.
Yeah.
And they have land from like 50 hectares, maybe up to 200. And they are going to hand over this property to their children. So they're taking care of the forest. Yeah. They are managing the forest. Yeah. They do silviculture. They invest in their property.
They're proud of it.
They're proud of it. And the sawmill and the pulp mill companies, they have to compete, making bids on the cutting rights that these private forest owners sell. And they have to pay quite a high price to be able to cut and buy saw logs and pulpwood and all this. And that makes the companies, the sawmill companies, pulp mills company, very efficient, because they have to pay so much for the wood. So they work with all the cutting costs, very productive technique, how to bring down the transport cost, how to...
So give me an example of that approximately. But I'm saying here in our region, here in the Prince George region, we probably pay between $130 to $150 a cubic meter for timber if it be delivered to the sawmill.
Yeah.
How would that compare to Sweden?
I think it's the same cost for a sawmill company for the logs delivered on the yard. But I think it's less money that goes to transport, because I explained that the sawmills are not that big, so they are spread out all over Sweden. They have a shorter distance to transport. So I think a normal transport would be around 100 Swedish crowns, and that's about $12.
Yeah.
And the logging costs, because we have done all these thinnings, so when we log quite big trees.
Right.
So the harvesters are very productive. So we talked about it yesterday, maybe $10 to $12 for the harvest to logging cost.
Right.
So the forest owners get the bigger part.
Right.
And that means that the forest owner can invest in planting 2,500 seedlings, and very good seedlings that will grow 40% better than the forest before.
So what the sawmill operator will say here in BC is that the cost of fiber is too high, and so we are not economically viable, one, and two, there is not enough fiber. So my idea, and with my peers, where I somewhat different from them, is that saying, okay, will the cost of fiber go down? I say no, not likely. So then what does it look like going forward, or what should it look like going forward? I say that the future of the sawmill industry in British Columbia is that we will have to go in the direction of innovative primary in combination with intensive secondary. What does that mean, innovative primary? That means, to me, the sawmills will become smaller. There will be more technology. It will employ less people, and they will start making different products. And what does innovative primary and intensive secondary, what does that mean? That we have to add more value to the fiber, and either we do that at the sawmill level, or sawmills are usually not very good at here doing that, or we develop strategic relationships with viable secondary manufacturers like Brink or others, or we do sell it to independent further value-added manufacturers. And that's kind of, in my opinion, how it will look like. And then the other part of the innovative primary would be what I say, of the 100% production that you manufacture, 50% will go up the value chain. That means 25% of the lower part goes up the value chain, and 25% of the higher value or better, higher quality fiber will go up the value chain. And that's, in my opinion, how it would look like. Less people involved, more technology, better recovery, and then further remanufacturing of at least 50% of the fiber that you manufacture. It will not be here. What we are doing is saying, well, if the timber prices don't go down to where we can afford it, and we're going to keep making 2x4s that nobody wants, and if we can't do that, we'll do it elsewhere where the timber is cheaper, until we're no longer competitive there either, because we got too many sawmills there now. In the US Southeast, they meaning in a general sense, but the Canadian or the BC companies have invested in about 20 sawmills there. Yeah. And then the existing sawmills in the regions have sizable dollars invested, so they have a capacity of 7 billion board feet more volume of mainly 2x4 dimension, and so that's what's happening there. And then coming back to BEC, I believe what we have to do here, and that follows what Richard is saying, is that we have to start with looking at forest policy right from the ground up, get rid of the tenure system, and then start developing forest policy from the bottom up, looking at the entire system.
Yeah.
And from my point of view, I've been here many times, 10 times now. We have had tours to 30 countries in the world, and we have things to learn from both sides.
Yeah.
And I think for the Canadian, for your country and also for BC, what Richard said, if you can move more land into more private land, people take care of it in another way. Like one of the travelers said today, if it's a Sunday, I can go out and plant trees because I know this will be passed on to the next generation. So the responsibility during the rotation time.
But it's somewhat like farming, right?
Yeah.
It's what we do here sometimes, with all due respect, is that the coastal area distinctly different from what the interior is here.
Yeah.
We have the cedar, the Douglas fir, and we have some amazing fiber. If you look at these trees, these massive trees, we should preserve that, and it probably has a higher economic value than cutting it into boards. Yeah. And the other part that is happening now in BC is that a sizable portion, I think up to 12%, maybe as high as 20%, will be designated to First Nations that will have that fiber. They own that fiber as part of their treaty settlements, and that's probably a good thing. The key then becomes, what do they do with that fiber? And will they be able to build entrepreneurship around that? And I hope that will happen. Mm-hmm.
Is there any chance that the state will sell out forest land, or the province?
Has
it ever been discussed politically?
Oh yeah. The state doesn't have any money, right?
Yeah.
They only get money if they take it from you first, and then so that's kind of how it works, right? So the key then becomes, if you talk to any of the forest companies, and I was one of the longest serving board members of the Council of Forest Industry, I think for 30 years, and I was the vice chair of the Council of Forest Industry. I resigned in April because I distinctly differ in their strategic objectives looking forward. And I believe that, as I already said, that the future of the industry is innovative primary in combination with intensive secondary. We have to do more on the land base, but it seems to be that organization is controlled by a couple of major companies, and they want to go in a different direction than I do. But on the other hand, I believe that where we are now, Richard, is that so many communities have lost their jobs all throughout British Columbia that there is more and more pressure from the public as saying this has to change, but must change is likely starting right with the tenure system, is that the tenure should go back, and then we should redesign the forest or the forest policy to follow. The wheel has already been invented. There's other places in the world that have the same fiber, the same land base, and the models are right there, so. And
you need a land reform, a new land domain act, as you had 100 years ago.
Correct.
For people to settle down and take care of the land, and then in the long term you will have a lot of fiber for industry.
And I believe that's where it will go. Is the political will there to do it eventually it will be there. I know that, and I have said to my peers, the big major manufacturers, that that be more sensitive to those issues, and if we don't, as an organization, because we're all in this together, if we don't do that, then at some point the public will demand it, and everything will change. But back to your question as to that then it becomes a question. Okay, Richard, you have X amount of volume of tenure. You think it's worth whatever, and so then it becomes a question of the public may say the timber doesn't belong to you; it belongs to the people of this province, and simply because and then with that go certain policies that are always understood, is that with access to the people's timber goes what they call appurtency, the social contract, that the lumber should be manufactured in the region where it was harvested, so that the public or that the people in that region have the benefits of job creation. Where now a lot of times what is happening, devastating through the province, some of the communities, we have an operation, and you've been there, Jan, before, in Houston, where Canfor was, the biggest sawmill in the world was in Houston, was shut down. It will never, and it will be taken down, and they're not sure they will rebuild, but they have more than 1 million cubic meters of timber there.
Okay.
That is tenure, and the people, but that's the second sawmill that has been shut down. West-Fraser had a sawmill there too, and then I have a value-added plant there, and I have no fiber, and then there's 2 other ones. So that community of probably 2,000, 3,000 people at max has lost probably 1,500 jobs, direct. And for every direct job, there's 2 indirect.
Yeah. But as John suggested, if there was this land reform, and private people could buy some forest land, and also big pension funds could buy forest land, and then it will create jobs managing all these forests.
See, what you would have
with pre-commercial finning, with finning,
I
road
agree with
build.
you.
Yeah.
And
So
the same with First Nations, right? So then, if your circle is here, half of it is public, the other half is pension funds and communities and bigger companies, and ours it would be the big circle, and then say half of it could be the public, and then First Nations would have 25%, and the other ones, whatever it is. But they all would look at it in terms of that it has to be a renewable resource, because the First Nations ones, still evolving a bit as we speak, would be area-based timber that belongs for them. It's not tenure. They own that part as part of the treaty.
yeah.
And we need it. The globe need it. We are 8 billion people today. In the 1970s, we were 4 billion. 1920s, 95 years ago, we were 2 billion. So for the globe, for the development, we need forest
for
land.
the global carbon footprint.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
So what Sweden is doing now is that the amount they harvest, and they are planting more trees, and I forget the number now, but I read it someplace, a major number they are adding to help with the global carbon footprint, so that making that, so the best thing to do is plant trees.
Plant and take care of it and try to do it quite intense on big part of the land. Of course, you need some native forest as a stabilizer in the landscape, but you can be very intense to take care of the carbon and for the climate. That's one of the most important things for the coming years.
About that. The other, Richard, I wanted to ask you about is that, so what you do is you, I forgot the numbers now exactly, but you acquire sizable volumes of timber and fiber for pulp and paper mills So the one of the problems we have here is that because our pulp mills here rely on chips,
Yeah.
and so my understanding in Sweden is that a lot of the fiber for the pulp mills comes from thinning process.
About 50% of all the volume cut in Sweden is from thinnings, and 50% is clear cut.
Right.
And that means that a pulp mill or a paper mill in Sweden gets about 50% of their sourcing is pulpwood from thinnings. And about 25% is pulpwood from clear cuts, where the big saw logs are taking out, and the small dimension wood goes to the pulp mill.
How about the chips?
The chips is the last 25% of the sourcing.
Oh,
Comes from the sawmill. So when a company like the one I was regional manager, we bought these cutting rights, about 3 million cubic meters. Half of it was pulpwood from thinnings and clear cuts, and then I sold all the saw logs to the sawmills. But when I did this business, I said, for every cubic meter of saw logs I sell to you, sawmill owner, you will give me 2 cubic meters of chips.
yeah.
So I can feed the paper mill.
Yeah, so as part of the deals.
Yes.
So here, what I find, and we drove by that yesterday, and when you saw it, we have 2 pulp mills sitting here, Prince George Pulp and Intercontinental. Unfortunately, because of the smoke and the fog, we couldn't see the other pulp mill way in the back. That's the Northwood Pulp. That's a fairly large pulp mill, upgraded excuse me, since the early 80s. But the other 2 were built in the mid 60s.
Yes.
And they shut down the one pulp mill and may have to shut down the other one, so that the only one left would be Northwood Pulp, because there's not enough sawmills supplying chips. So if they use thinning, from my particular viewpoint, do you get bark and all the other things then involved in the grinding up, and does that affect the paper or the pulp process? But the mills say here, or the larger companies like Canfor, about 7 or 8 pulp mills have shut down, and probably another 2 will shut down here if there are some more sawmills going down. Is that saying that the reason that the pulp mill goes down because the chips from the sawmill are the only economically viable fiber they can use, implying that the other fiber is too expensive for their process? Is that the key?
Well, I don't know.
No, but from your experience in Sweden.
From my experience, thinnings in Sweden, they are profitable for the forest owner. They get a little profit out of selling a cutting right in thinnings. And then I think the Swedish paper and pulp mills, they need different types of fiber to produce different types of pulp.
Correct.
So at the Swedish pulp mill, they sort out the wood that comes from thinnings, the pulpwood that comes from clear cuts, and then they have the chips from the sawmills. And then when they produce a quality for a certain customer, they mix. We have to take like 50% from the thinning wood, 20% clear cut wood, 30% sawmill chips to make this specific product, this specific pulp that maybe goes to a special paper company down in Europe and so
Right.
on. So they have different recipes
Right.
to different customers.
Yeah.
And because and I cannot go into whether these pulp mills here, if they can afford to buy pulpwood from Finnings, but I think, I mean, with this contractor that we met today, Liam, and his company, he has harvesters that could do finning, and I think the transport cost down here from where we were today, it's reasonable. So I think it would be okay.
See, what we are doing now is that it's mainly chips, but also pulp logs that are marginal logs, not suitable for sawmills.
We saw that today. Yeah.
Thinning, if you wish, maybe already, but I think it can possibly go further, potentially, if it is economically viable, right? So those kind of things. Yeah.
If we compare what you showed here, the volume that you are cutting here, it's about the same volume we do from thinning on the same area in Sweden.
Right.
And we are more north than you are.
Right.
If you look for that, even if it's the growing rate is a little less if we look for the paper, but through thinning and pre-commercial thinning you can get a higher growing rate per hectare.
Right.
For sure.
So as we kind of getting to the end here fairly quickly, but a couple of things that I want to still. So if I look at Sweden, same species, growth rate would be, if compared to us, I believe most of the trees that grow here, spruce pine would be in the 60, 70 area. And if we do a good job of thinning, allowing and managing, doing 2 cycles of thinning or 3 cycles of thinning, that would expedite that somewhat, I presume.
I'm not sure what you mean with 67. You mean the rotation time?
Yeah.
Yes, we have seen in Sweden that we have been getting less growing time. So from in average maybe 80, 90, depending on where we are, down to 60, 70 years.
So wouldn't that be very similar to where we are here? If you kind of
the experience of the forest we see here compared with where I live in the middle of Sweden is very similar. So
yeah.
I think the grow rate it's more the same than the figures we can see here, and it's very dense. The young forest we see here is very dense as well. So just go in and do pre-commercial thinning. Maybe one thinning is enough to get the grow rate to go up. And
yeah.
And the whole meaning with thinning is that instead of having the growth on 4,000 trees per hectare, so every tree gets small, you do pre-commercial thinning, and then you do 1 or 2 thinnings, and then you end up with like 700 trees per hectare.
Yeah.
And then you get the growth on the real trees which you will cut logs from.
Yeah.
So in 60 years you will get trees that are 30 centimeters in diameter. And that's the whole idea. You will get more saw logs out of the trees.
Yeah. It is just managing it like a farmer would do it for yields and return of whatever products that he's looking for. The other thing that I find interesting is that, looking at this again for a second, is that industry employment, and this was quite a while back, but I don't think the numbers are all that much different. You probably have double the amount of employment than we would have over that volume. That's kind of the way I look at it.
I'm not sure about the numbers today. I don't know if you know, Richard, how many people in the forest industry. I have seen it, but I can't remember. for today.
Maybe 70,000.
Yeah.
Yeah, because of the value-added manufacturing, that the number is sizably higher than what we would get. Once we go here to the smaller mills, more technology, then the sawmills would employ substantially less people, but if we do intensive secondary manufacturing, that would easily make up for it. That's the point that I'm making.
Yeah.
And that I see that in Sweden already was that way is because of the primary and secondary manufacturing, that it is nearly double of what we have here,
Yeah.
That can be true.
Yeah. And then so Richard in particular, and obviously because of Jan has been here several times, this is your first time in Canada.
Yeah.
So give me your impression.
Well, I'm really already fallen in love with the country because all the people I meet here is so very friendly, so polite, and so interested, and very open. And I think that's a good start for a country when people are open and friendly. And that means that people can cooperate, develop new ideas. You get this entrepreneurship and so on. So that's, and then it's a very beautiful country.
It's huge.
Yeah, we've been to the Rocky Mountains here, and today we have seen forestry and very skilled people doing their best job in the forest. But I think there could be a lot of development here. Yeah.
But it's still young, right?
Yeah.
Relatively speaking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I wish you all the best with this transition, and hope you come through it. I think you will.
Yes.
Yeah.
The one resource that we have in the province of British Columbia is that, or in Canada, period, we have entrepreneurship, and entrepreneurship means that people that are working with a passion, are very determined and come up with new ideas. Can you give me a copy of my books there? Oh, it's here. The other thing that I had, and I have to just do this. While I have we have a lot of people watching us from all over the world, and especially today, and we will have in Sweden as well, because we're going to boost this one in Sweden.
Okay.
And so I had the opportunity to meet with all the people on your tour, which is always amazing to me. And I think you've been coming here for nearly 13 years with slight interruption, and then the other thing that you gave me is something. Can you show me this, Jan, what it is? So this, for our guests to look at this, and Jan had a bit of a story around this. This is very unique for my guests to Sweden, and the camera is right there. Yeah. So and then on here is 2023, and Jan had done it 10 years. Can you explain this? Where does this idea and concept came from?
The horse is one of the most famous symbols for Sweden and for tourists coming to Sweden. People are coming to see how they make this. But the old story is that the loggers and people working in the forest 200 years ago, in the evenings were sitting carving from spruce. PCABs, the Norwegian spruce. They carved this in the evenings, and then the women were painting them in the county of Dalarna. It's a county in the middle of Sweden. And to the World Expo 1939, the Swedish pavilion, and Sweden thought we should have something attraction for this pavilion. And one person said, we make a big dollar horse. So they made like a real horse in this size in wood, and in front of the pavilion in New York. And the year after, I think they sold 20,000 of them. And since then, it's a symbol all over the world. And we went to the expo in Dubai now, Expo 2020, and there was a
Right.
big dollar horse in the Swedish pavilion as well.
Right.
So we brought it. I think I gave this first time I met you,
Yeah.
and now it's a special gift. I went up to the place where they make this and told them to write down Skogsresor, our company name,
Yeah.
10 years for hosting us and for this exchange between Sweden and Canada. So it's a
Yeah.
little special gift.
Yeah, and it has been such a pleasure to meet your group, and that have such an interest in the industry, and to see them come to Canada and really appreciating, looking at Prince George and the region all around this beautiful, beautiful country. And so it will have a special place in my office in Victoria, actually. The other thing,
And
yeah.
also we are giving suggestion here that we can see that it's possible to improve your use of land, but what we bring with us also is that you have so much experience from the pine beetle pandemic here that started 25, 30 years before us, or 20 years before us. For us it started about 5 years ago, and we have 25 million cubic meter that have been killed by another spruce beetle.
Right.
But you have so much experience how to handle killed wood into the mills.
Right.
So that's something very interesting for us to understand, that we can still
Yeah.
use the wood for logs, for 2x4s or whatever. And I don't think it's for competing with you. It's more for the people, for the world,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
build good houses, to be less need of fossil fuel.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of things to learn from you also. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then together, what we have is that the wood is so special, and like I said before, that when I grew up in the lumber industry, we wouldn't step on a piece of wood. We wouldn't do that. Was not allowed. The other thing that I had an opportunity to be with the tour and then give the tour a bit of a look of the Prince George region. So I was in the bus with them for an hour and a half, and obviously I can't speak Swedish, but Jan does a very good job of interpretation. But a lot of people did speak English on the bus. And so I had the opportunity to give them a book about who is this guy. That came with his $25.47 to Prince George in 1965, and July 1965, about a couple of blocks away. I had $25.47 in my pocket, but what I did have, attitude, avoid the negative, passion, believe deeply in what you want to do and find that passion, and then work ethic, and what follows that is success. And my dream was to build my own lumber mill and to prove to myself that I could do it. And then for so many years after that, including you suggested it to me, you should write a book about it. And so here's the book that I wrote. It's available on all major media. I did an audio as well, Against All Odds. And it's not about hurrah, hurrah, John. In fact, it's to the contrary. All the hardship and all the challenges that are on with it, and then that success that follows. And it took me 80 years to live it, 20 years to think about it, and then 2 years to write it. So that was the first one that I wrote. And then the other one that I did, again, Against All Odds, I think it's interesting. And then the other thing that happened to me is that I found out when I was 57 years old, 57, in 1997, I was already here for quite a while, and I had challenges with my academic career. Was not very good. I failed grade 3, failed grade 7 3 times, and then started working. They said, should we send him to the mentally challenged school or should we get him a job? Fortunately, they got me a job as a furniture maker. And so I've always been challenged by that. But then when I walked into a bookstore here, I picked up a book. I still don't know why I did it, And the book was called Driven to Distraction. It was about ADHD. I had no idea what it was. And as I started reading it, I said, oh my God, that's me. And I wrote in it in Dutch. Now I finally know who I am. But I was ashamed of it in a way, and there was stigma attached. How do I go to the banker and say, I want to learn this and do this and the other thing? Oh, by the way, I have ADHD. And you say, okay, well, have a nice day, right? So, but anyway, I wrote a book about that as well. And the book is not only for those that have ADHD, but also for people that are slow learners, have been affected by trauma, or other things that make them, for whatever reason, slow learners, or have a difficult time sitting in a school for 4 years and then having all kinds of things, talked about that they have absolutely no interest in. And, but I call it ADHD a superpower. Yeah. There is no question in my mind. I couldn't have done all the things that I've done as running about 6 or 8 different companies, and then being obviously an author and a podcaster, and then a professional speaker, and then and then doing that all, the latter part in particular, since I've been 75, and then I'm supposedly the oldest professional or competitive bodybuilder in North America. Hello, how about that one? So anyway, enjoying life and living with passion. And so then I felt the other part that I wanted to do, and just wanted to show you this one, is finding your passion, living the dream. And I see so many people that don't like what they are doing, and in fact, I searched some numbers from the United States recently that 70% of the people that are working don't like their jobs. And 75% of them are looking for another job. And how unfortunate that is, because it affects your whole life. And then you say to me, John, how about you? Are you living the dream? I am, so I'm going to live till I'm 120. And I'm going to try very hard to get there. Now, did I give you a copy of this one, Jan?
No.
I'm going to give you one, Paki, and same for Richard. I didn't give you one. Can you give me one more? Yeah, thanks. And
it will be very interesting to read. Yeah.
Yes. Looking forward to that. And when you're telling this, I'm thinking maybe my passion is travel, because I have this travel company, Forest Tours, and coming on and on here to meet you and to travel and to meet other people and have exchange. That's my passion, I realize.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much.
And I have a little fun story that I can tell you, John. From the first meeting with you, when I was doing research for these tours, I came up here with my woman, and she's working with children with ADHD today. And I said to her, I will just go into this Brink forest and see if we can have a stop here if you are coming with the group. I will be back in 3-4 minutes. I come into your office. In a couple of minutes I met you, and you started to talk your story and what you're doing here. And I was so impressed. I came back to her in 1 hour in the car. and that, I have to say, it was not the best minutes I have had together with her, but she's still there, so
yeah, that's a good
so
sign.
that was a nice
yeah,
it was a very memorable meeting we had in 2010.
We'll have many more.
Yes.
Richard,
thank you so much, John.
Guest,
yeah, it was an honor.
Yes, and same for me.
Thank you, John. Thank you,
really
John.
Appreciate it.